Book 2, Chapter 1, Part 4 of History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 1, by Henry Charles LEA. Book 2, Chapter 1, Relations with the Crown. Part 4. Although the episode of Giudice is thus closed, the fate of Macanaz is too illustrative of inquisitorial methods and of royal weakness to be passed over without brief mention. He had incurred the undying hatred of the Inquisition simply in discharge of his duty as an adviser of the crown, with perhaps an excess of zeal for his master and an intemperate patriotism that strove to restore its lost glories to Spain. It was impossible to continue him in his high function while recalling Giudice, and, as a decent cover for banishment, he was allowed, in March 1715, to seek the waters of Bagneres for his health, when he departed on an exile that lasted for 33 years, to be followed by an imprisonment of 12. Giudice promptly commenced a prosecution for heresy, sufficient proof of which, according to the standards of the Holy Office, was afforded by his official papers. As he dared not return, his trial in absentia resulted, as such trials were wont to do, in conviction, and he seems to have been sentenced to perpetual exile with confiscation of all his property, including even 500 doubloons, which the king was sending to him at Pau through a banker of Saragossa. All his papers and correspondence in the hands of his friends were seized, and his brother, a Dominican friar, whom the king had placed in the Suprema, was arrested in the hope of obtaining incriminating evidence. Thenceforth he led a life of wandering exile, so peculiar that it is explicable only by the character of Philip. He was in constant correspondence with the high state officials and was frequently entrusted with important negotiations. Sometimes he was under salary, but it was irregularly paid, and for the most part he had to struggle with poverty. When the Infanta Maria Ana Victoria was sent back to Spain from France in 1725, he was commissioned to attend her to the border, and from there he went as plenipotentiary to the Congress of Cambrai, with the comforting assurance that the king was endeavoring to put an end to the affair of the Inquisition, an effort apparently frustrated by the influence of Pere Daubenton. It was possibly with a view to overcome this fatal enmity that he occupied his leisure between 1734 and 1736 in composing a defense of the Inquisition from the attacks of Dr. de Leon and the Abbé de Bos. In this he had nothing but praise for its kindliness towards its prisoners, its scrupulous care to avoid injustice, the rectitude of its procedure, and the benignity of its punishments. Beyond these assertions, the defense reduces itself to showing that, from the time when the Church acquired the power to persecute, it had persecuted heretics to the death, and that the heretics in their turn have been persecutors, propositions readily proved from his wide and various stores of learning, and sufficient to satisfy a believer in the semper et ubique et ab omnibus. 10 years later, when Fernando VI ascended the throne in 1746, Macanaz addressed him a memorial on the measures requisite to relieve the misery of Spain, and in this he superfluously urged the maintenance of the Inquisition in all its lustre and authority. In spite of all this, it was unrelenting, and his entreaties to be allowed to return were fruitless. In 1747 he was sent to the Congress of Breda, where he mismanaged the negotiations, deceived, it is said, by Lord Sandwich. relieved and ordered, in 1748, to present himself to the Viceroy of Navarre at Pampeluna. After some delay he was carried to Coruna and immured incommunicado in a casemate at the castle of San Antonio, a prison known as a place of rigorous confinement. Even the authorities there compassionated him and, at their intercession, he was removed to an easier prison and permitted the use of books and writing materials. Here, during a further captivity of 12 years, the indomitable old man occupied himself with voluminous commentaries on the Teatro Critico of Padre Fejo and the España Sagrada of Flores, with many other writings and memorials to the king. It was not until the death of the latter, in 1760, that Elizabeth of Parma, the regent and the cause of his misfortunes, liberated him with orders to proceed directly to Murcia. At Leganes he was greeted by his wife and daughter, with whom he went to Jaén, his birthplace, where he died on the following November 2nd, in his 91st year. There is no record of any further exercise of royal control over inquisitors-general until, in 1761, Clement XIII saw fit to condemn the Catechism of Mesengui for its alleged Jansenism in denying the authority of popes over kings. The debate over it in Rome had attracted the attention of all Europe, and the prohibition of the book was regarded as a general challenge to monarchs. Carlos III had watched the discussion with much interest, especially as the work was used in the instruction of his son. He expressed his intention of not permitting the publication of the prohibition, but, by a juggle between the nuncio and the Inquisitor-General, Manuel Quintano Bonifaz, an edict of condemnation was hastily drawn up, of which copies were given to the royal confessor on the night of August 7th. They did not reach the king at San Ildefonso until the morning of the 8th, who at once dispatched a messenger to Bonifaz, ordering him to suspend the edict and recall any copies that might have been sent out. Bonifaz replied that copies had already been delivered to all the churches in Madrid and forwarded to nearly all the tribunals. To suppress it would cause great scandal, injurious to the Holy Office, wherefore he deeply deplored that he could not have the pleasure of obeying the royal mandate. Carlos was incensed, but contented himself with ordering Bonifaz to absent himself from the court. He obeyed and, in about 3 weeks, made a humble apology, protesting that he would forfeit his life rather than fail in the respect due to the king. Carlos then permitted him to return and resume his functions, and, when the Suprema expressed its gratitude, he significantly warned it to remember the lesson. He took warning himself, and, on January 18, 1762, he issued a pragmatica systematizing the examination of all papal letters before issuing the royal exequatur which permitted their publication. Carlos III had no further occasion to exercise his prerogatives, but it was otherwise with Carlos IV. His first appointee, Manuel Abad y la Sierra, Bishop of Astorga, who assumed office May 11, 1793, had but a short term, for he was requested to resign in the following year. His successor, Francisco Antonio de Ranzana, Archbishop of Toledo, who accepted the post September 12, 1794, was not much more fortunate, although his enforced resignation, in 1797, was decently concealed under a mission to convey to Pius VI the offer of a refuge in Majorca. He was followed by Ramon José de Arce y Reynoso, Archbishop of Saragossa, who resigned March 22, 1808, 4 days after the abdication of Carlos IV in the tumult of lackeys at Aranjuez, probably to escape his share of the popular odium directed against the favorite Godoy. During the short-lived revival of the Inquisition under the Restoration, its dependence on the royal power was too great for differences to arise that would provoke assertions of the prerogative. The relations of the crown with the Suprema were originally the same as with the other royal councils. The king appointed and removed at will, although, as the members came to exercise judicial functions, it was necessary for the Inquisitor-General to delegate to them the papal faculties which alone conferred on them jurisdiction over heresy. Ferdinand exercised the power of appointment and removal and, as his orders were requisite for the receivers of confiscations to pay their salaries, it is scarce likely that any one had the hardihood to raise a question. We have seen how he forced the members to accept as a colleague Aguirre, although he was a layman; how Ximenes, when governor of Castile, removed him and Adrian reinstated him. The earliest formula of commission that I have met is of the date 1546. It bears that it is granted by the Inquisitor-General, who constitutes the appointee a member and invests him with the necessary faculties, and it is moreover countersigned by the other members. In this there is no allusion to any nomination by the king, although the appointment lay in his hands. In 1573 the Venetian envoy Leonardo Donato so states, adding that the popes felt very bitterly the fact that they had no participation in it. They had repeatedly tried to secure the membership of some one dependent upon them, such as the nuncio, but Philip would not permit it. The council did nothing without his consent, tacit or expressed. At some period, not definitely ascertainable, the custom arose of the Inquisitor-General presenting 3 names, from among which the king made selection. At first the number of members was uncertain, but it came to be fixed at 5, in addition to the Inquisitor-General. To these Philip II added 2 from the Council of Castile. As these were sometimes laymen, he finally had scruples of conscience and, in his instructions to Manrique de Lara in 1595, he tells him that when there are fitting ecclesiastics in the Council of Castile, they are to be proposed to him for selection. If there are not, it is to be considered whether a papal brief should be procured to enable them to act in matters of faith. These adventitious members came to be known as consejeros de la tarde, as they attended only twice a week, and in the afternoon sessions of the body, where the secular business was disposed of, and thus they took no share in matters of faith. Their salary was 1/3 that of the others. The royal authority was emphatically asserted when, in 1614, Philip III ordered that a supernumerary place should be made for his confessor, Fray Aliaga, with precedence over his colleagues and a salary of 1,500 ducats; also that when the royal confessor was a Dominican he should always have this place and, when he was not, that it should be given to a Dominican. The Suprema accepted Aliaga, but demurred to the rest when Lerma peremptorily ordered it to be entered on the records. There were murmurings followed by submission. After the accession of Philip IV, he ordered the council to make out a commission for his confessor, the Dominican Sotomayor, to which there was ineffectual opposition. The rule held good. Soon after the Inquisition was reorganized under the Restoration, Fernando VII, July 10, 1815, appointed his confessor, Cristobal de Bencomo, a member, to serve without salary for the time, but with the reversion of the first vacancy and all the honors due to his predecessors. He had the seat next to the dean and when the latter died, February 16, 1816, he took his position and salary. Philip V ordered that a seat should always be occupied by a Jesuit. This, of course, lapsed with the expulsion of the Jesuits in 1767, after which Carlos III, in 1778, provided that the religious orders should have a representative by turns. The royal power of appointment was not uncontested and gave rise to frequent debates. Philip IV sometimes yielded and sometimes persisted. Occasionally the question was complicated and papal intervention was hinted at. A decisive struggle came in 1640, in which the Suprema chose its ground discreetly. It suited Olivares to appoint Antonio de Aragon, a youthful cleric and the son of the Duke of Cardona. Anticipating resistance, Philip announced the nomination imperiously. Don Antonio must be admitted the next day, as he was about to start for Barcelona, and any representations against it could be made subsequently. The Suprema replied that the Inquisitor-General could not make the appointment, and if he did so it would be invalid. Don Antonio was less than 30 years old. The canons require an inquisitor to be 40, although Paul III had reduced for Spain the age to 30. The members of the Suprema were inquisitors, and it was only as such that they sat in judgment without appeal in cases of faith. To this, Philip rejoined that Olivares should report the efforts he had made to quiet his conscience in view of the great public good to result from the appointment, wherefore he expected that possession would be given to Don Antonio without delay. Matters went so far that the Duchess of Cardona wrote to her son to abandon the effort, but the royal command prevailed. He obtained the position, and in the following year he was made a member of the Council of State. He was already a member of the Council of Military Orders, and the whole affair gives us a glimpse of how Olivares governed Spain. Having thus asserted his prerogative, Philip, in 1642 and the early months of 1643, made 4 appointments without consultation. The remonstrances of the Suprema must have been energetic, for Philip yielded and, in a decree of June 26th or July 2nd, 1643, he agreed that the old custom of submitting 3 names should be renewed, with the innovation that the Suprema should unite in making the recommendations. Against this the Inquisitor-General protested, but in vain. It was probably to make an offset to these royal nominees that, November 2nd, 1643, the Inquisitor-General and Suprema asked that their fiscal should have a vote, which Philip refused. The rule continued of submitting 3 names for selection, but the participation of the Suprema in this seems to have been dropped. The royal control, moreover, asserted itself in the case of Froilan Diaz, when, by decree of November 3, 1704, Philip V reinstated 3 members, Antonio Zambrana, Juan Bautista Arziamendi, and Juan Migueles, who had been arbitrarily ejected by Inquisitor-General Mendoza, ordering moreover that they should receive all areas of salary. While thus the crown continued to exercise the right of selecting the heads of the Inquisition, its practical control was greatly weakened by 1 or 2 changes which established themselves. Of these, perhaps the most important was the claim of the Suprema to interpose itself between the king and the tribunals, so that no royal commands to them should be obeyed unless they should pass through it, thus rendering the inquisitors subject to itself alone and not to the sovereign. In a government theoretically absolute, this was substituting bureaucracy for autocracy, and, when the example was followed, though at a considerable distance, by some of the other royal councils, It at times produced deadlocks which threatened to paralyze all governmental action. We have seen that, towards the end of Ferdinand's reign, his letters to the tribunals were sometimes countersigned by members of the Suprema, but that this was not essential to their validity and, when there was an attempt to establish such a claim, he was prompt to vindicate his authority. A royal cedula of October 25, 1512, gave certain instructions as to the manumission of baptized children of slaves whose owners had suffered confiscation. There was no question of faith involved, but when, in 1514, Pedro de Trigueros applied to the inquisitors of Seville to be set free under it, they refused on the ground that it had not been signed by the Suprema. He appealed to Ferdinand, who promptly ordered the inquisitors to obey it. If they find Pedro's story to be true, they are to give him a certificate of freedom, and meanwhile are to protect him from his master, who was seeking to send him to the Canaries for sale. The claim which Ferdinand thus peremptorily rejected was persistently maintained during the period of confusion which followed his death. Whether it received positive assent from Charles is more than doubtful, although the Suprema so asserts in a letter of July 27, 1528, ordering inquisitors to examine whether a certain royal cedula had been signed by its members, for the kings had ordered that none should be executed in matters connected with the Inquisition unless thus authenticated, thus basing the claim on the royal will and not on any inherent right of the Holy Office. So complete was the autonomy thus established for the organization that a Carta Acordada, or Circular of Instructions, May 12, 1562, tells the tribunals that, if an inquiry from the king comes to them through any other council, they are to reply that if the king desires the information, it will be furnished to him through the Inquisitor-General or the Suprema. The far-reaching importance of this principle can scarce be exaggerated. One of its results will be seen when we come to consider the complaints and demands of the Cortes, and find that fueros directed against inquisitorial aggressions in purely civil matters, when agreed to by the king, were invalid without confirmation by the Inquisitor-General. A single instance here will suffice to show the working of this. In 1599, various demands of the Cortes of Barcelona were conceded by Philip III. One regulated the number of familiars, which Philip promised that he would induce the Inquisitor-General to put into effect within 2 months if possible. Another provided that all officials, save inquisitors, should be Catalans. He agreed to charge the Inquisitor-General and Suprema to observe this, and he would get it confirmed by the Pope. Another was that, in the secular business of the tribunal, the opinion of the Catalan assessor should govern, because he would be familiar with the local law. This he accepted and promised, in so far as it concerned the Inquisitor-General and Suprema, to charge them to give such orders to the tribunal. Another was that commissioners and familiars should not be "religious," to which his reply was the same. Another required the Inquisitor-General to appoint a resident of Barcelona to hear appeals in civil cases below 500 libras. This, he said, was just, and he would charge the Inquisitor-General to do so. After this, in fulfillment of his plighted word, he addressed the Inquisitor-General in terms most supplicatory. "I charge you greatly that for your part you condescend and facilitate that what they may have supplicated may be put in execution, in conformity with what I have conceded and decreed in each of these articles, which will give me particular contentment." Not the slightest attention was paid to this request and, on May 6, 1603, Philip repeated it. "As until now it is understood that not a single thing contained in it has been put in execution and, as I desire that it be enforced, I ask and charge you to condescend to it and help and facilitate it with the earnestness that I confidently look for." This second appeal was as fruitless as the first, and the Catalans gained nothing. It is true that, in 1632, the Barcelona tribunal, in a memorial to Philip IV, asserted that Philip III had only assented to these articles to get rid of the Catalans, and that he wrote privately to the pope asking him not to confirm them. This case may have been more jugglery and collusion, but in general it by no means followed that the royal decrees sent to the Suprema for transmission were intervals until, perhaps, the matter was forgotten or dropped or some compromise was reached. The privilege that all instructions must be transmitted through the Suprema was therefore one of no little importance, and it was insisted upon tenaciously. There was a convenient phrase invented which we shall often meet: obedecere y no cumplir, to obey but not to execute, which was very serviceable on these occasions. In 1610 the Suprema argued away the cedula of Philip III as invalid because it had been dispatched through the Council of State, and the king was repeatedly told to his face that the laws required his cedulas to be countersigned by the Suprema in order to secure their execution. This was done to Philip IV in 1634 when he intervened in a quarrel, and in 1681 to Carlos II when there were difficulties threatened with foreign nations arising from abuses committed in examining importations in search of forbidden books. As the questions calling for royal interposition as a rule affected only the wide secular and not the spiritual jurisdiction of the Inquisition, this created conditions unendurable in any well organized government. End of Book 2, Chapter 1, Part 4.